Alright, time for another DraftScience video presentation. More specifically, draftphysics.com, blah blah. Anyway, so the V guy. So let's understand some context. He went to the trouble, okay, to go to some forum and post one of the paradoxes there, the Lewin one, free momentum, the free momentum paradox. Again, which makes my question to him pretty relevant. Do you understand that weight is momentum, is energy? You know, which he didn't answer, by the way. Kind of a simple question. He took it as an insult that I'd ask it, but it is fundamental, frankly, to the whole argument. And more fundamental is, I'm realizing, is the idea that what's missing in physics is a good understanding of scatter, because scatter is elemental to what happens with photons, and it's elemental to what happens with energy. All we're really discussing is there a difference between the laser beam, okay, the amount of photons, the energy, the amount, the number of photons in a laser beam, and the amount of photons in a light bulb? And what's the difference? Well, in one, the light's going everywhere. In the other, the light's going in one direction. And you could almost argue that energy's working the same way, in the sense that you're really just talking about things with high velocity are focused. You know, the energy is it's going to hit a smaller location, more concentrated, because the mass is smaller. You know, obviously you can make very large things, spatially large, give them a high velocity, but we know that they're less effective because it's spread over such a large area. And it works in the inverse for collecting energy. Like if you want to collect it from the wind, you make a sail, and you try to make the sail as light as possible, you know, to maximize what you're getting out of it in terms of reducing the weight of the thing you're pushing. So it's really easy to understand, in my opinion, starting from that simple principle that, you know, and it gets to the chicken person made some comment, so it's sort of related to that too. But anyway, so there's some simple principles here, but I've gone over the bad history, okay, so he hasn't acknowledged the history's really bad. He doesn't really acknowledge that the absence of evidence probably means something. Probably just not an accident that the experiments don't exist. It's that they can't be explained, and so that's why they don't exist. You know, the paradoxes. And like I said, one of them disturbed him enough to feel the need to go seek an answer, and he got rubbish as answers. I mean, I don't know how he could concede there was anything other but rubbish. He got basically a concession. Yes, there is perpetual motion and theoretical, you know, blah blah blah. I mean, every answer he got did something silly like saying, "Oh yeah, well you have a paradox. You have perpetual energy, you know, machine. You have a free energy machine until you get to infinity, and then it all falls apart." Well, who cares if it falls apart at infinity? We're not going to do infinity. We're not going to do an infinite number of experiments. We're just going to do enough to get lots and lots of gold. I mean, it's almost like saying if the chicken that lays the golden egg lays an infinite number of eggs, it dies. Well, who cares? I'm not going to force it to lay an infinite number of eggs. I'm only going to say, yeah, lay me a few hundred 100,000. You know, I'm not going to force it to go to infinity. I mean, it's just the answers were so bad and so illogical. Well, anyway, and so he starts making these comments, and he's got in them veiled a attempt to clearly, I would call it almost a subversive, not an open and upfront statement like, I still believe in kinetic energy and think it's reasonable. He doesn't say that, but his comment indicates it. So I react to it with some skepticism of basically its sincerity and whether it's even logical. Reasonable. Let's not even say logical. Just in the realm of a reasonable thing to be saying, you know, the useful work kind of phrases and stuff. You know, in my opinion, canard kind of linguistics. You know, just just kind of bullshit rhetoric. But anyway, so we're having this back and forth. He's blaming the medium as being the problem. You can't communicate these ideas in text. You can't explain blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to argue, part of that's true, but part of that is bullshit. Clearly, you have a lot to explain away. Okay, the bad history, the lack of experiments, and the paradoxes. It's a lot to explain away. And you're just magically saying, but I have the magical vision of it. I can see why it makes sense. So he sees in the laser beam twice as much energy, let's just say, or 4 times, or 10 times, or 1,000,000 times more energy. And he gets that, okay? It's more energy than the regular light bulb. So 5 watts of energy doesn't produce 5 watts of light. The laser beam has more. Somehow it magnified the wattage, even though I can't collect any more than 5 watts, frankly. I can burn a little spot on your skin, but that doesn't mean anything. I have a mirror outside, and I've noticed that just by having a mirror, in an upright position, when the sun hits it, it reflects another sun onto the grass. And it's actually killing the grass. And I just thought that was kind of funny that it's not like magnifying it a tremendous amount. It's just doubling how much. There's 2 suns in the sky. From the grass's perspective, there's 2 suns. And having 2 suns is just too much. Which, just 2. And this kinetic argument goes into these extremes. The rocket ship example, where you've got 2,000 joules going this way of energy, 2,000 watts going that way, and 2 watts going that way. The gun, 1,000 watts of energy going that way, only 2 watts, 4 watts going that way with the gun. He says that makes sense to him. I'm saying it violates Newton's third law. What's the point in having it if Newton's third law doesn't relate to kinetic energy, if it doesn't mean the same thing, whether you believe in momentum or you believe in kinetic energy, it has to mean the same thing. It has to apply to both, or does it mean anything? So, anyway, so then I won't read all the comments, but frankly, they're not even coherent. They're not even connected to the subject. He just quotes what I said and is completely non-responsive to any of it. So what's the point? There's a bunch of my quotes here, and he doesn't respond to them in any way that's useful. That's literally what my comment was about. No, your comment wasn't about answering any of these questions. You're saying that something going 30 miles an hour somehow doesn't get the energy, but something 60 miles an hour somehow makes more energy. The same energy goes in. I push it this hard. Somehow the 30 miles an hour can't convert it into real energy, and somehow the 60 miles an hour can. And if it was going 120 miles an hour, I could convert even more energy. And if it was going 1,000,000 miles an hour, I could convert it into even more energy. You're saying that makes sense. You're not explaining how it could make sense. Anyway, I just won't bother with all this. So he's just saying, Draft said no one of his issues with kinetic energy's explanations has been conceptualized part. Has been so it's the concept that's wrong. The squaring of the velocity just can't make any sense because it's just arbitrary. It's making a volume that just is totally illegitimate. There's no reason for it, and there's no way to explain where it came from. Where does this extra power come from for something because it's going fast as a longer velocity vector, that somehow it can give things more velocities in the universe? It has more velocity to give, merely because it has more velocity. That you just magnify the velocity. So the more velocity you have, the more you magnify how much you have. Can't make any sense. You're blowing up a balloon, and somehow, as you're blowing it up, the air you're blowing in gets more and more capacity to blow up the balloon. It blows up faster and faster as doesn't make any sense. Anyway, so he says, well, I'm done. I can imagine how kinetic energy and its relation to work could make sense. So he has some image of it working, even though it creates obvious paradoxes. So you have to change something about it. Some way in which it's described has to be changed, or you're stuck with the paradoxes between momentum and kinetic energy. So you have to in some way say momentum doesn't mean anything if you believe in kinetic energy. Because if you don't, then you're stuck with the paradox. And I think my pointing out that weight is momentum proves that you're going to have a really hard time getting rid of momentum, because frankly it's fundamental to what happens in the world. I gave the hydroelectric example. What is the energy of the water? What's the component? Well, yes, of course it's gravity, but the point is it's weight. It doesn't have any weight without gravity acting on it. So clearly the only thing significant about the water is its weight. The weight is doing the work. Anyway, mechanically, logically. So it can make sense to him. But he just can't. And then he says, and that's all that matters to me. What matters to me is the truth, frankly. I don't want to believe falsehoods. I don't want to believe things that aren't true. And we're arguing, in a sense, from the huge scientific failure of them not providing evidence, right? You'd have to agree that this really sucks that we have to argue the truth and there's no evidence on the evidence table. I showed you the car thing, and that's some evidence, but it's not the exact experiment. They didn't measure the time when the one block isn't moving at all, and therefore it could be completely different. Even though they're saying, they're implying certainly that it's got a rule applies. I played Sumner and I played Lewin. The only two guys that really did some experiments in front of your face. Not the only two, but the only two that did it worse. Better than just absolutely terrible. We just don't have much evidence, and that's a real problem. And you're not even conceding in this environment that maybe that's part of the problem. The communication part breaks down because we can't point to anything. We can't have a common reference, and so you can just make up stuff. Is the way I would look at it, in terms of how something can how this energy thing is like some sort of wooey swirly shit or something. I don't know what you're making it into, but clearly to me, by definition, I even gave you the definition of the joule and the watt, and how they haven't even connected that to weight, which is so obvious. The definition of a Newton, a definition of a joule or a watt is 100 grams falling 1 meter. That's the definition of the thing, and they haven't just sat there and done it. They haven't done that simple experiment. Let's just drop 100 grams, measure it on a scale, and see how much it weighs. Then we'll know how much a watt weighs. We'll know how many pounds of water creates a watt, and all that stuff. We'll know it all. All right. Anyway, so that was just such a statement. Very disappointing. But what are you going to do? Blah 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 blah. I'm sorry you're don't require better than that to have some sort of belief still. How vacuous does the religious argument have to get before you say, are you going to still concede? Well, I can imagine a Jesus, and I can imagine an immaculate conception, and I can imagine walking on water, so therefore it must all be true. Or it must be plausible. Yeah, plausible. Come on. Anyway. All right, Chicken Little said so. Well, generally speaking, I could say I don't like. At risk of becoming Sunday dinner, I would argue that all forces, I am a vegetarian, I would argue that all forces are compressible. So I don't even know what that means. All forces are compressible. The force is little bits of stuff. So yeah, if it's a box of BBs moving, and you're saying the force is basically its momentum hitting the outside surface, clearly the force is compressible. But that really doesn't have anything to do with anything here. That doesn't have anything to do with these interactions and exchanges. All right. and that the effects of force are dependent on the matter in which it's induced. Well, everybody would agree with that. That clearly there's a difference between a tennis ball and a steel ball and what else is there? A lump of clay or a piece of rubber that actually moves the energy in all kinds of directions. All right, so it's back to the scatter argument, though, realistically. A non-compressible collision, so this is just, such mushy talk. A non-compressible collision does not induce the total available force to motion. Well, of course it does. That's a Newton's cradle. So Newton's cradle, steel balls, not compressible. So your argument already fails in a sense of trying to use this compression versus decompression argument. The argument is scatter. Okay, so I'll draw it just once. Okay, but the difference between all these things, so the steel balls hit each other, what happens? Well, the energy goes right through at the speed of sound in steel the object, and if there's nothing here to hit, then the energy has to reflect. It doesn't really have a choice. Electrons will go popping out here on this side. They won't be able to leave because the atoms aren't going with them, so they're going to come back. You could say the atoms, actually. Some of the atoms push out. They start moving. They start going that way. And the rest of the atoms say, I'm not going. Okay, they're not in the mood. All right, and so they have a fight, an argument, and the side that says we're not going wins. And so this stuff has to come back in, and when it comes back in, it creates energy in this direction, which causes this to leave that way. All right, so that's steel. And then you go to the rubber crap, okay, which is basically just springs. So then what do? You hit the two things into each other. They both D-shape, let's say. Or you could have one in, you can do combinations. You can have hard thing, soft thing. Anyway, they D-shape, and what does the D-shape represent? It just represents a spring. It just represents something that you can deform, but it will reform. Okay, so it's a storage device. So the energy is now stored in the reshaping of the object, but it will release the energy back in the same directions again. It'll stay on the same path. The energy doesn't go this way, and the energy doesn't go that way. And then you go to the classic clay, the two clay things. You throw them into each other, they deform, but there is no spring, and they just stay deformed. They might end up just twisting a little, actually. And where's the energy going? Well, the energy went this way, and the energy went that way, and the energy went into moving little bits in all kinds of directions, which is essentially heat. And the heat comes with it reshaping of the object, and this is now what you got as a permanent object. So you made a permanent change. Rubber ball, temporary change. Steel ball, the energy is still vibrating inside the object, and depending on whether there's some, depending on whether it can transfer it, get rid of it, okay, it keeps it. Just like something in space, you give it a temperature, it'll kind of keep that temperature because it has to radiate it. It can't radiate it atomically. It has to radiate it in the form of photons. So the only way something in space can get rid of its heat is to radiate it in, infrared. It can't just connect to something else and let the vibrating atoms here make these atoms vibrate. There's no atmosphere to take the heat away. I would argue that all forces are compressible and that the effects of force are dependent on the matter in which is induced. Okay, so everybody goes through that. A non-compressible collision does not induce the total available force to motion. So induce is not the right word, right? Does not convert, you could say. So a non-compressible collision, that would be steel, let's say, does not induce the total available force to motion. So of course it does. Newton's cradle works, so that statement's wrong. It's a wrong premise. You can't say that. I'm saying that's error. I have to put a line through it. Whoops, you got that part of the problem wrong. Okay. So and that a compressible elastic collision, so this is just more nonsense that elastic is compressible, when no, that's not the definition. So all there is scatter and not scatter. If you're scattering the energy, it's going to be called inelastic. If you're not scattering, it's elastic. Pretty much. Compressible elastic. So now you're talking about elastic in the sense you could put springs between things to store the energy. So, it's just still, you know, this is physics. I mean, this is physics in 2021, right? We're sitting here. Physics is giving us such poor language and such poor ways to understand something so elemental as energy, and they've given us these pitifully bad words to use, elastic and inelastic, when a tennis ball and a steel ball are both elastic, which doesn't make any sense. All right, collision has the ability due to the quality of matter. So again, it's not some quality of the matter. We know these are just materials, and that you can have materials that you can deform and they'll reshape, a spring. Okay, and you have ones that you can break, like a piece of glass, and they're not going to go back to being a piece of glass again. The pieces aren't going back to where they were. To capture and return more available force. So again, it's not to capture and return, it's to not scatter, not convert into unseen energy. So for the energy to be visible, it has to stay on the line of movement you're watching. You can't watch little tiny pieces inside of it move around, so you can't watch heat. Not very well, anyway. They certainly probably could make clay that would change color based on its temperature and make it more visual, because you'd see the two pieces of clay hit each other and then they would change color. Due to the time that the force can be applied. All right, so this is where, who knows where it's going. All right, to capture and return more available force due to the time that the force can be applied. So again, more implication that this stuff doesn't happen very quickly inside of the objects. That the force is actually moving very quickly. The force that matters, that is the pressure between the electrons, moves extremely quickly. And so when you're sitting on the spring, it doesn't take long for you to know, once somebody says, launch, once they, pull the release, you don't sit there and go, oh, I'm getting pushed. No, you're getting pushed, okay? Your maximum velocity, in a sense, is going to be the instant it's released. Okay, and return to acceleration, and returned as acceleration by using the formally induced, the formally inducing and now momentarily arrested matter mass. So I don't know how that could mean anything to anybody. And return as acceleration by using the formally inducing and now momentarily arrested matter mass. So you moved atoms. Springs move a lot of atoms, right? But the atoms move back. Okay, so that's the interesting part. They don't stay moved. I would deduce, too bad you didn't deduce that you can't be playing this game with the word elastic and saying that hard things aren't elastic, because by definition they are. Anyway, I would deduce that the time available to induce, capture, and retard force is greater in an elastic or compressible collision. Right, now I'm arguing exactly something different, which is all you're really doing. It's nature, the way the system is, it's like you go into a gravitational well and you start orbiting a planet. The fact is you can leave anywhere you want. You can leave in any direction. It's going to take you as much energy to leave exactly in the opposite direction. You'll go in and come right back as a U-turn, as it would to, keep going forward or go that way or go that way. Any way you're going to get out of that gravity well is equally energetic. So essentially, these turns are for free. Okay? And that's all that's really the argument here, is that there's a difference between energy that stays on the path, where it's plowing the snow ahead of you. Okay, it's still going the same way. And we know that it reflects. We know we can shoot waves through a wave machine, or we can shoot things at a wall and bounce them straight back. And it doesn't cost much energy at all. The tennis ball bounces back with very little loss. So we know that you can have that complete conversion of energy going this way into energy going that way. It doesn't cost anything. Well, the same is true for energy going this way. You can convert it this way too. And we're just talking about materials, okay, that keep it on the same path, and materials that will cause it to scatter in other directions. And once it goes in other directions, it's like the difference between a light bulb and a laser beam. It doesn't look like energy anymore. So when the two clay things hit each other, it doesn't look like energy, but there's plenty of energy. All right, and that there's plenty of atoms moving, and then there's plenty of photons being created, and then there's plenty of light, in the form of infrared radiation being emitted. There's plenty of energy. We just don't see it. All right. So, and that factor is responsible for the added or retarded force observation. So he deduces that there's actual more energy in stuff, and somehow we're not seeing it. So it's the same argument as the 10-ton train one. So even though I've minimized what you could logically say where your losses are going to be. So you have a 5-ton train going 10 miles an hour. You add an extra weight, okay, just with the tiniest drop, less than a millimeter, right? You have it just so perfectly timed, just less than a millimeter drop. So you have a little bit of energy going down on the wheels, creating a little tiny bit of extra friction. But that's essentially all you've got. And the only other thing you have is the friction between the two objects when you drop one weight on the other weight. But that's, again, a tiny amount of frictional movement will take place, a tiny amount of heat. So you have tiny losses. And when they do the experiment, that's proven out. Okay, so that one I have shown you with a little ticker tape. They measure the speed, they drop the weight, okay, and the momentum is conserved. Like 99% of the momentum is conserved. The speed is just a little bit slower than it should be. So instead of going exactly half the speed, it goes a little tiny bit below half the speed. And that accounts for that little bit of extra jitter and friction and noise you put into the system. But otherwise, you did a pure conversion. And so you're arguing that somehow there was a whole bunch of hidden energy that just somehow went somewhere. We lost it. It was destroyed. It was, it flew out as photons. It flew out as sound. It flew out as deformation. All these words they use. Physics girl used all these words. She showed an apple being exploded by a ping pong ball or some other kind of thing. That somehow all of that was happening when the weight was dropped on the train. When none of that was happening. And the outcome of your velocity being conserved, in the sense that your mass to velocity ratio conserved, demonstrates that there was no big energy loss. So I guess it's just no point. I mean, I've gone over that so many times, that example, and here you are still preaching to me that there's all this hidden energy somewhere that got used up, that didn't get actualized. Yeah, it did. There was no extra energy in the 5-ton train going 10 miles an hour. It didn't have any more energy than the 10-ton train going 5 miles an hour. And I can keep saying it over and over again. You don't have a single experiment in the history of mankind ever collecting one of these circumstances where you have an inverse ratio and you actually collect the extra energy. You actually show the 5-ton train, you put a generator on the wheel and you actually generate twice as much energy. You light twice as many light bulbs. You don't have a single experiment demonstrating it, and yet you're still defending it. All right, let's see. And that factor is responsible for the added or retarded force observation. So I don't even know what the factor was. beyond you saying some kind of vague mush, I would deduce that the time available to induce, capture, and retard is greater in an elastic or compressible collision than that of a non-compressible. I don't know. And that factor is responsible for the added retarded force I've dropped on the floor. Small bounce. Dropped on a spring, big bounce. So we know that that just has to do with how elastic the ball is you drop. So you're not going to change it much. You're not going to change it. You're not going to give, well, I don't know. I haven't done a super ball with a spring on it. CC. I mean, because the mass of the spring would be much smaller. That's not exactly like doing the basketball, baseball thing or the basketball, tennis ball thing. What if you do it the other way around? The tennis ball on the bottom and the basketball on top. Maybe it don't work. So the spring would be much less massive than the object you're dropping, and therefore you're not going to get much for your trouble. Anyway, dropped on clay, no bounce. So again, who cares about the bounce? We know that when you do drop it on the clay is going to change shape, that it took energy to change its shape, and none of that energy was returned. It stayed in the clay and went into the atmosphere and other things. Let's see. Could it be all about the available time to induce force into matter? Well, clearly it matters how much time there is, how fast the spring can expand. So that's another argument. You can have a stiff spring or a weak spring, and that's going to make a difference. Because the stiffer the spring, the faster it can move, and therefore the faster it can give higher velocities to objects. So if you need, for a half, to do the opposite conversion from a 10-ton train to a 5-ton train, you kind of understand that if you compress the spring with a 10-ton train, the spring has to be stiff enough to give the extra twice the velocity to the 5-ton train. If the spring can't expand quick enough, then it can't give the energy to the 5-ton train because at some point it's moving faster than the spring can move, and therefore it's left the spring before the spring finished pushing. So it really depends on how fast something can be accelerated, and whether your spring is capable of accelerating faster, because it needs to be able to move faster than the object it's pushing. I can't push something once I go as fast as I can run. Let's just, it's that simple an argument. Once the thing's going faster than I can run, I can't push it anymore. Even though I might have more energy to push with, I can't convert it into a push because I can't catch the object I'm trying to push. I can't touch it. So even though my arms are ready to give it another extra push, if it's going faster than I am, I can't give it the extra. All right, so that's probably enough. I'm just saying in the context of all these videos, it's been months and months now of all these explanations. I've explained the paradox, explained the bad history, explained the lack of evidence, explained, these comparisons between how to understand what your weight is. Your weight is a momentum you got from gravity. Clearly, that's what it is. And that's your energy. Energy is momentum in a direction. It's weight in a direction. The more you are weighing, a bullet weighs, maybe 10 tons, by surface. If you're going to compare it to a 10-ton weight and you say how many pounds per square inch is that 10-ton weight able to produce, you could argue that, yes, the bullet's able to produce the same weight as a 10-ton weight, that over a larger surface. And that's, why doesn't physics ever use that? Why doesn't physics explain it as simply as what it is? A velocity is saying that this contact point, is a pressure, is a weight, and it's going to hit an object. And you have a pounds per square inch ratio and all that stuff, and all that's going to determine how the other object is affected. So frankly, in the context of all of these videos and all of these explanations, this is all just looks like mush. What I don't have from any of you people is a concession that the history is ugly. I mean, it's just dirt ugly, okay? Leibniz believing in monads and solitons. Living force is what it was called. Then the regurgitation of it by the French woman using the clay experiments, when you can know, oh shit, I just mixed the clay different and I get a different answer. That's terrible physics. That's awful science. That's pseudoscience. The conniving of the mathematical formula, changing Newton's F equals momentum, changing momentum over any unit of time, changing that into F equals ma and saying it's Newton's formula, when no, Newton didn't play any game with anything called acceleration. He played a game understanding a change in momentum was a change in your velocity. In experiments where you're not going to change the mass, the only thing you can the only thing that changes is the velocity. So of course acceleration is going to be part of it, but acceleration is just a change in velocity. And a change in your velocity is a change in your momentum. And it's happening continuously. At every moment in time, you have a momentum, and it changes, based on your velocity, based on the force that went in. So the force does equal momentum, and that does equal energy. That's the rational derivative. They perverted it into mush. You ignored all those arguments. You've ignored the paradox arguments. You can't concede. Yes, paradoxes aren't a good idea. It's weird that the physicists haven't explained the paradoxes. Or it's weird that all the free energy guys haven't figured out how easy it is to make free energy. Because it's obviously really easy. You have dealt with none of the arguments and conceded anything about how bad this science is. The fact that we don't have these simple, that physics never took 100 grams. The definition of a joule is 100 grams falling 1 meter. I mean, the definition strictly is lifting 1 meter, but you have to lift at the same speed as gravity for that even to be true. So it's exactly the same as dropping 100 grams in gravity, hitting a surface. That impact is a joule. And they've never done the experiment. They never dropped 100 grams on a scale, on a spring, and said, let's see how much it weighs. That doesn't mean anything to you as an argument, saying, wow, physics is thin. This physics is so thin, so underdeveloped, so under-scrutinized, it's so irrationally all over the place. One physicist will tell you momentum is perfectly conserved, and the next physicist will say, no, there's this 1.4 thing that happens. Come on. And instead you just type this mush saying, well, maybe there's a sparkly boogie boog inside the middle of matter and it absorbs the energy, the sparkly boogle boog. Maybe this, maybe that, maybe. Why? Why are you doing this? Because you can't concede, wow, physics is a real undeveloped science. It's not even a science, it's so bad. They just imagine like you. They imagine stuff, talk to their friends. If enough of their friends fall for it, then they all believe it. And that's the definition of a religion, frankly. That's how religions get off the ground, is they just start telling big fish stories about, well, and then Jesus cast his lure into the pond and he caught the great white whale and blah, blah, and just, and the whale ate him, but he chewed his way out. And, just some silly story, some silly exaggeration. Ugh, anyway. All right, well, I don't know. I can say, the hell with you people. Human race is pathetically incapable of advancing itself in any kind of rational manner by just recognizing when it's stuck in a hole. You can't even recognize that the science is in quicksand. Okay, these are silly wave particle duality, quicksand, bent space, whatever the hell that is, a non-mechanical thing. Okay, it can't possibly be mechanical, right? Because we already know space is nothing and you're bending nothing, so there's no mechanics to it. They said, if Einstein said bent ether, you probably wouldn't have fell for it, right? You would have said, oh, well, that sounds silly, bent ether. How do you bend the ether? What's causing the ether to bend? You'd ask all kinds of questions. But because he called it nothing, bent nothing, because you can't even, what's space? Space isn't steel bars, or space isn't, you know. Shit. So, yeah. So, yeah, I'm just so disappointed. I really didn't think people were, really, I thought smart people were, like, smart. And, man, just, not even close to doing smart right. Not even close to being at all skeptical or, logic whores. They're not thirsty for logic at all. And, they'll take any irrational pile of mush as an answer as long as it suits, makes them feel okay, makes them comfortable. Whatever. Just, alright. That's enough of a video. Another depressing interaction, I must say. But I'll have to endeavor to persevere because that's all there is. It's like Clint Eastwood thing, talking to the Indian, the Josie Wales thing. You don't live or win, or something like that. You just die, and that's it. So fuck that. You got no choice but to, show up and try. And then Yoda will say to you, there is no try, there's do or not do not do. Yeah, that's right. Fuck the trying part. I mean, the trying part isn't of any value, except it gets you to the doing part. Because you have to try before you're going to do. So that's for sure. Anyway, even philosophy is all fucked up. Stupid talking green lizards. Why the hell are we listening to him? Alright, anyway, till the next time and such and so forth and whatnot. This has been a DraftScience video presentation.